I better wait.
Yes.
Thanks very much. So my presentation is about stories of proximity to death. How in the life stories of asylum seekers, so young men who made it to Europe but are still waiting for what's going to happen next, how death fares in their life stories, what sense they make out of it as people that, while being still very young, have been close to it, have been witness to it, or have risked it as a part of their migration trajectory to Europe. So I am approaching death as a sort of a looming absence, as something that is not here now, but has been very close by, that elicits a number of memories, fears, and connections that have also to do with the senses, with how people, like my interlocutors in asylum centers in Italy, find themselves in a situation of safety, of protection, but also of overexposure to memories, thoughts, and feelings to what might have happened to them and to what did happen to many like them. It is my argument that while people like young asylum seekers typically cope with this through silence, which is a very important topic that has, again, clipped through the presentation over the last couple of days, they still are exposed to forms of more or less random, but still meaningful connection with death that deserve more analysis. I do so just very briefly positioning my own research, which has not had to do so far primarily with death, but rather with the questions of home and homemaking in displacement. More recently, with the multi-ethnography in a particular asylum centers, where questions of death, among many more, have also popped up as a sort of empirical encounter, in a way saying that death is an absence that is always potentially present, is commonsensical. It takes another meaning and another weight in the life stories of people that did experience a significant proximity to it. Along the way, I have done a couple of related publications, one of them precisely on ungrivability in the Mediterranean with the Chiara Penaro, who was mentioned this morning, who did an important empirical and activist work about this. A book on my own research on what it means for asylum seekers to be doing nothing, as I would frame it, in their everyday life in refugeehood, so while waiting for their cases to be assessed, and then an ongoing book project on which Thomas and I are working right now, which will definitely benefit from the variety of insights and comments we are collecting over this couple of days. So my case study is just one ethnography of one house in which I was lucky enough to get access as a frequent visitor over a number of years in Italy, with a number of young male residents, mostly West Africans, who had a right to stay there as long as their cases were assessed, and as long as they had no better option or sources of income or of job or whatever than staying there. So my question here is, what death means under these circumstances and how people cope with the memories, feelings, concerns associated with it. By the very fact of being there with their own bodies, young asylum seekers are witness to resilience to death, to the fact that at least in a biological sense, they made it, they survived it. At the same time, past exposure to a high risk of death is not going to disappear forever. It creeps across a number of interstices that have also to do with the sense, with how memories of the past loom in a number of ways, with what my interlocutors would typically call thoughts keep coming over and over. The more they seem to have nothing to do in their everyday lives, the less they are supported by welfare agencies, has been increasingly the case in Italy over the last few years. So my questions are, first, what forms of proximity emerge to death, emerge over their migration and life course? And second, how do they cope with them? Question one, is it possible to revisit their trajectories of fleeing in terms of a number of ways of being closer to death, which are not always or only literal ones. There is quite a large literature in anthropology primarily on migrations as also a tentative way out of social death, out of a perceived and very real life predicament of stagnatory life conditions of social, economical, and family arrangement that do not allow, particularly in this case for young male people, the normative aspired transition to adulthood, to male personhood, to becoming people able to be autonomous, to take care of the others, to take an active role in their own world. Migration has also to do with this, although the notion of social death itself has a larger set of meanings that also applies to those who, after leaving, betray the expectations of their community of origin and no longer keep in touch and cut their own ties. At the same time, the very fact of leaving home, apparently for good or with no idea of when one will come back, can be experienced as a form of death or a separation heavy and groundbreaking enough to push people in a way to relativize what will come next. After we made it, the argument of my informant often was a number of challenges that will come at a later point still matters, are still here, but are kind of a lesser concern because the watershed has already been gone through. Things have already changed and will no longer be the same, which is also, by the way, an important biographical thing to be kept in mind when looking at the trajectory of so-called secondary migration across Europe. For people who left, for people who survived the Mediterranean, crossing one more border is going to make little of a difference, both in terms of resilience on their side and of having nothing to lose, of impossibility to go back at that stage unless one is really forced through by deportation, which in Italy, despite all the bad things one could do about Italy, is a rare option, if only by lack of political infrastructure to implement it on a large scale. So, and second, perhaps more predictable thing has to do with death along the way. We all know how trajectory of forced migration, of undocumented migration, if you wish, like the ones from Africa up to Europe, are intertwined with stories of death. We know well how far the sheer amount of death is hard to be completely estimated. We all have heard a number of stories about this. To me, it just made some difference to hear this directly from someone who was there, who was a witness, who was on a boat like thousands more, and happened to survive basically by chance. The point is, there is nothing particularly distinctive in narratives such as this one. What is distinctive to me is to be faced with the real experience of the people and to see how, such as in this story, in a very random moment, I was sitting in the room of O, as I would call him, just looking at TV program when there was some documentary of the sea, something like that, that elicited the memory of death and all that came afterwards. It's as if the past were always somewhere in the background, and at some point in a random but powerful way, it can pop up again, and again. Italy itself takes as a synonym of the place where I am now, could be the France, I guess, the same, I guess, for a number of countries of Europe, takes up a very ambiguous meaning. It is the same country that, at an early stage, saved our lives. A number of people, among those I met over time, particularly, I would say the ones with a more reflexive attitude, trying to articulate some sort of gratefulness toward Italy. They did save us at sea. At the same time, which also goes along with a very pervasive and deep-rooted self-representation of migration, of making it to Europe as being born again, as the new life that starts, if only to continue then in ways that do not meet the expectations or the aspirations or maybe the dreams people had in the first place. So Italy then, back then, was those who rescued us from death. Italy, right now, a few years afterwards, is, by sort of a paradox that people struggle to make sense of, the same country, the same institution, people, or whatever, that keep us stuck. Refugeehood as a condition of protracted asylum, of spending possibly years in the same shelter with nothing much to do unless one struggles and is lucky and good enough to do that, means to be in a sort of dead time and space, to be in a condition in which a number of people, including the person I would call M in this sentence, feel betrayed in their expectations. Because the narrative typically goes, I did my best, I tried it, I had all reasons to expect that once I would be away from my country, things would be better. They apparently are not, which is a source of all bad feelings and bad thoughts, and also very much calls into question the presence or the absence, such as in this case, or of any meaningful interaction between young male asylum seekers and the mainstream world around them. So, for a number of people, at least in the here and now, Italy may mean, at least for a while, being back to social death. Something happened. All right. At the same time, dwelling in the center has to do with waiting. There's a huge literature in anthropology, in the humanities, on waiting, from Waiting for Godot by Beckett to a number of deep, rich and anthropological studies. There is perhaps, however, not so much literature on forgetting. And Asylum Center is also, among many other things that have to do with waiting, with surveillance, with exceptionalism, and so on, and so forth. It is also an institutional device, in my understanding, of forgetting, where people there have no reason, no incentive whatsoever to be back to what happened. They struggle to forget. They are encouraged to do so, while all their cases for asylum have to do precisely with remembering, with producing a compelling narrative of the supposedly true refugees. Life in asylum, in protected shelters, works right the opposite way. The more one is effective in forgetting, the better, the short term, for his way of being. Which again brings back to the importance of silence, which is not nothing. It is not an empty space or time, but it is a way for people to keep at some distance what they are not in a position, in a condition to control, to negotiate better than that. However, the past is there. The stories of proximities to death are there. It may happen that some people go back to them to revisit, to make sense of them in a number of ways. It may happen that, again, from all sorts of conversations, the stories emerge back, including as a source of mixed feelings, of indebtedness, of emotional connectedness with others, such as in this excerpt with the friends of a person I would call Anne, who, even on the day he was granted protection, told me I couldn't celebrate. There was nothing to hurrah about, because I just thought of those who did not make it. I am, well, whatever may happen, however you may wish to see me, I am the lucky ones relative to them. So the death also means carrying along the kind of moral and emotional burden of the term of comparison, the gratitude in some ways toward those who didn't make it, on which I will get back a bit later on to 5 minutes, right? There is, however, importantly, for my interlocutor as much as for anybody else in the migration context, a potentially transnational side of death, which has nothing to do with border crossing as such, but with the more general predicament of living in migration. Whenever it happens that your dear ones in another country do pass away, you don't have time, money, legal status, or whatever to be back, and you are expected to find vicarious ways of participating into grieving, of making yourself present while being absent. Like, again, the story of this person I would call O, who told me about the story of his father passing away during COVID, and suppose how can one participate in 2 ways that are not necessarily related to each other. The first, the more obvious and universal ever, as far as migrants are concerned, remittances, sending money. So overcharging money with meanings, with expectations, with emotions, whether they meet them or not, and trying to keep memory over and over. So in this case, memory is not something to be pushed away as possible, but something to be cherished as far as one can. Again, having to do with death. However, there's also a future dimension to death, which brings us back to the understanding of good death that Thomas was proposing this morning. For the people I met and stayed with, good death means at some point in the future to be back. The predominant understanding being here, center Italy or wherever. Europe is a good place, hopefully, to live or at least to work, but it is not a good place to die. I want people will typically say, I can live here, I cannot die here. There is an expectation of homecoming, which is ironical in a way for someone who claims he cannot make it back unless at risk of their life, but it is still there and has to do with the moral geography of good death. The future is not always so far away, anyhow, as in the case of Salim, the only person I chose to keep with his own name, because he's no more among us. He happened to lose his life just a few months after getting his papers at last. He asked why he was about to die out of a severe disease to be buried back to his country of origin. He told us many things, as is often the case, and I see narratives, writing in this case, as something of a way to keep something of people of their own memories alive, rather than in the realm of death. So I just wanted to share quickly this memory about Salim. In this case, again, the future doesn't exist in a way. It may still exist through the stories and memories that are produced about him, I believe, or at least I hope. Now, in a few more minutes, how do people cope with the weight of past proximity to death? What are the tactics and the dilemmas that emerge from my ethnography? Some of these are very obvious. People try to forget, as long as they are successful in this, which is hardly the case. They try to do things. The typical argument was having a job, whatever job, was seen as a privilege, no matter how exploited people were, because it was much preferable to stay there with people who say nothing to do, and to stay there with the memories that were looming again and again. There are ways of sharing something of the past life with a number of languages, words, as much as language of the body, of emotion. There are sometimes, in the best case, increasingly less so in Italy, I would say, ways to access to dedicated support, which in turn into a number of challenges on which I cannot expand now. There is what is, to me, as a sociologist, the fundamental question. Proximity to death is, at the same time, a very intimate, individual, private experience, and one that is collectively shared by thousands and thousands of people in the same predicament, but disconnected with each other. In other words, it is the ideal terrain on which forms of sociological imagination, as Charles Wright-Smith would have put it, can be nourished over time to turn what is an individual concern into a social and hence political question, which is precisely, I believe, what pro-migrant and no-border activism has been trying to do over time, as challenges as the task is. Anyway, people may articulate this in many ways, including for the person I would call A, through drawings. I always found myself with this particular person, Senegalese migrant, to communicate better in a way through drawings, such as this one of the saving of his boat from the Italian Red Cross or whatever else, than through words. Or to be back to say it better, his word made more sense, were more powerful as embedded in his drawing, as a way to articulate more than words only could afford him to do, including key episodes of his migration trajectory, such as the rescue or the killings in Libya of his friends. There is a power to draw into other forms of naive, if you wish, art that is often greater than words when there are language barriers, when there are unequal levels of education and so on and so forth. This is also an important thing to keep in mind, I think. All these leave us with the three dilemmas, and I'm going to close with them. Really? The first of them is nothing but the universal condition of forced migrants. You must be on the verge of death in order to be born again. In other words, for the 90% of so-called refugees who do get a status, the condition to do so is to risk your life along the way. Otherwise, you will not make it. Anyway, there is nothing particular to my interlocutors in this. It's a universal topic that is central to the debate on the current asylum regime worldwide, but one is important for us to be mindful of. Dilemma two, this is more tricky, I believe. Why them and not me? This was what, in particular, a Gambian migrant who was very hospitable to me. We had long chats and afternoon, evening spent in his room, would tell me. He would tell me about his travel to Europe, about the number of people who lost their lives along the way. His question typically was why they lost their lives and not me. I was nothing better than them. And yet I made it and they didn't. It's something that raises a deep existential question, much more than a matter of guilt, I would argue. Something that is probably hard to be made sense of or accepted unless through a frame of religious identification and sense-making. And it is probably bound to stay, but still it's important to articulate, I believe, in the first place. Someone was quoting this morning, Montpellier, by the way, who did another way, a kind of similar argument in The Drowned at the Saved, one of his last books. Then number three, how are we going to tell this? The guy, the Senegalese drawer would often tell me, I can do all the drawings you like, but people don't want to see bad things. They don't want my drawings when I have people that are killed, violence, and so on and so forth. They do not want to see the violence. So how are we going to communicate this to people who didn't experience, and luckily for them, are likely to never experience this? So what the languages, what ways of communications are most suitable to make a difference here? So wrapping up the whole things, no response at all, I guess, to these dilemmas, but at least a belief on my own, and I believe of many of us, that expand as far as our position is concerned, expanding the conversation across different disciplines is also a condition to find languages to speak, to involve, to be relevant to a broader audience, to make the untellable at least a bit more tellable and relevant and interesting, and to move along directions of interdisciplinary dialogues, such as those pursued by Thanatic ethics, which I very much appreciate for this. Thanks.